I'm happy to introduce Professor Laurie Barron. She is a professor here at RWU School of Law, and I will let her take it away.
Sorry, guzzling my coffee. So, before I introduce Jamie, I have the pleasure of introducing Jamie. I just want to say this is a great day and a great room full of so many fabulous people. Like, I wish I could just sort of go around and meet everybody, because there's people Hasbro and the AG's office and immigration practices and Dorcas and Sojourner House and just Rhode Island Legal Services. I forget. South Coastal County's Legal Services. There's just so many great people. And I just want to say to the students who organized this, and the Providence Law Department, Central Falls Law Department. Yes. Okay. Now I'm going to get into trouble. There's so many great people here. The students who organized this, it's like a who's who in this field, and it's just been a great morning so far. I have the privilege of introducing Jamie Beck, and I want to say I didn't know Jamie at all, like 3 days ago. Connected us, and we had this fabulous conversation for over an hour while I was stuck in Providence traffic, and Jamie was, I don't know, probably stuck in West Coast traffic. Had so many things to talk about, had a lot of fun ideas for this panel. Jamie's amazing. She is teaching probably maybe the only trauma-informed lawyering class on probably in America, but on the West Coast at both Pepperdine and USC Gould. Jamie has over 10 years of experience representing trafficking victims and survivors. She's trained thousands of law students and lawyers and community members in trauma-informed and vicarious trauma methods. She owns her own consulting business. She started a nonprofit. She's going to tell you her story. Her story is incredible. And have fun, Jamie. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you for having me today. Congrats to the Law Review for putting on this incredible symposium. I'm truly honored to be here among leaders in this field that is really, I think, quite a relatively new field in the field of law. And I'm really heartened after sitting here all morning and listening to all the amazing attorneys and practitioners doing trauma-informed work in the field. I wonder if this conversation, I'm sure this conversation would have looked incredibly different 5, 10, 15 years ago, and I don't think it would have happened 20 years ago. So I'm very encouraged by today and grateful to be here. In her book, Daring Greatly, Brene Brown said, "Daring greatly means the courage to be vulnerable. It means to show up and be seen, to ask for what you need, to talk about how you're feeling, to have hard conversations." Today, I'm going to dare greatly and be vulnerable with all of you by sharing some of my personal experiences with vicarious trauma. I hope that my vulnerability opens up a door for you to have an honest conversation about how you're feeling and to talk to those in your support system about what you need. I remember being a 1L and learning the grim statistics about lawyers, mental health, and substance use challenges. Who learned about that 1L year? Did they tell you all the statistics? Yep. At the time, I remembered wondering, why is this such an issue for lawyers? Why is it so common in our profession? If you're not familiar with these statistics, let me share some with you. These are the most recent statistics from last year. 71% of lawyers said they had anxiety. 38% said they were depressed. 44% said they knew coworkers who struggled with alcoholism. And 16% of lawyers admitted contemplating suicide during their legal careers. After learning these statistics, I put them out of my mind. In law school, I learned to think like a lawyer. To me, that meant suppressing emotion in favor of logic. I started law school in August of 2008, right as the Great Recession was beginning. During law school, I volunteered at a free legal clinic for homeowners facing foreclosure and clerked at a plaintiff's law firm. These cases were intense, and I became deeply connected to the clients that I worked with. One case I'll never forget involved working with a woman whose husband died due to a defective product. I did her intake just days after his death, and worked closely with her over the next year. I felt her loss deeply, and while it strengthened my commitment to her case, I didn't understand the toll it was taking on me personally. After law school, I clerked for a federal judge, and then joined a large law firm in San Diego. As part of the healthcare litigation team, I worked on a maternal fetal death case. My role in that case involved reviewing medical records, preparing witness testimony, and knowing every painful detail of the case. That work was important, and I wanted to do it well. But it was also emotionally exhausting, and I was experiencing stress-related health issues. My doctor recommended acupuncture and told me to reduce stress. I laughed at her, saying, "I'm an attorney. Stress is an occupational hazard." After 5 years in private practice, I left to found Free to Thrive, a nonprofit organization that provides legal services and support to survivors of human trafficking. It was in that role, nearly a decade after starting law school, that I first learned the terms vicarious trauma, compassion fatigue, and secondary trauma. Reflecting on my experiences, I realized that nearly every area of the law touches trauma in some form. Criminal law, public interest, family, employment, immigration, personal injury, environmental, bankruptcy, all involve trauma. Even in areas where trauma isn't client-facing, such as appellate work, attorneys can experience vicarious trauma from reviewing disturbing cases. A few months into my nonprofit role, I was at a human trafficking conference and attended a session on vicarious trauma. I remember looking at the slide and listening to the symptoms and having an aha moment. I recognized every symptom in myself. I thought, so that's what's been going on all this time. Vicarious trauma, also known as secondary trauma, is the emotional residue from working with trauma survivors. Empathy is a crucial trait in our profession, and it means sharing our clients' pain, suffering, and trauma. Your body processes secondary trauma similarly to direct trauma. That's because when you hear or read people's stories about their trauma, your body thinks you are in danger. Trauma exposure triggers your body's fight, flight, freeze, and fawn responses, and it has a lasting impact that's nearly identical to direct trauma. In fact, the symptoms of vicarious trauma often mirror PTSD, and attorneys can easily find ourselves experiencing these symptoms without even realizing it. Moreover, most of us are called to this work because of our own lived experiences. And oftentimes, our work is also triggering our direct trauma on top of also giving us vicarious trauma. It was interesting hearing earlier talking about things like perfectionism as a trauma symptom. And that certainly is, my trauma symptom from my childhood trauma is perfectionism, overworking, high achieving. And I think a lot of us in law school probably share that. And it's, I think, just exacerbated in our profession. Trauma exposure can result in what's called compassion fatigue. That's when your emotional resources are so depleted that you have trouble feeling compassion. We can experience vicarious trauma from the media, from social media, and the news, particularly in moments like we're in right now, where every single day we're ingesting trauma. Every time we look at our phones, our TVs, talk to our friends and family, we're literally surrounded by it. So there's also layers of the trauma that we're taking in every single day. Moreover, individuals who are members of marginalized groups can experience vicarious trauma from seeing harm to groups they belong to. And they can also suffer from PTSD from after experiencing discrimination, racism, implicit bias, and microaggressions. All right, here's the slide, the symptom on the slides. The slide on the symptoms. Some of the symptoms, and this isn't even all of them, and I want you to look at these and really, really think about yourself as you look at these. Some of these symptoms: anxiety, depression, numbness, anger, emotional outbursts, irritability, substance use, sleep disturbances, relationship breakdown, social isolation, fatigue, hopelessness, hypervigilance, paranoia, and suicidal ideation. It can also change your worldview, including your sense of safety, trust, and self-worth. Professionally, it can show up as poor communication, diminished concentration, self-doubt, withdrawal, absenteeism, inflexibility, exhaustion, overwork, impatience, lack of purpose, lack of faith in our own work, or the legal system. Does this sound familiar? They align closely with the statistics that I showed you just a few slides ago. Yet, despite the fact that our profession recognizes the challenges that we face, vicarious trauma rarely enters these discussions. So, do any of these symptoms resonate with you? I want you to be brutally honest with yourself. Raise your hand, and I'm raising mine, if you've experienced any of these symptoms in the past month, day, week. Yeah, almost every single person in this room. Do these symptoms remind you of people you work with or have worked with? I imagine they do. As Lauren Markham insightfully put it, listening to these stories day in and day out, absorbing their gruesome details, has worn down even the most seasoned attorneys. As a result of the intimacy with suffering, lawyers and paralegals are struggling just to stay in the work. Since recognizing my own vicarious trauma, I've been on a 7-year journey to understand it and find ways to manage it. I've attended conferences, read books, researched solutions. What I found is that managing vicarious trauma is a highly personal journey. But I'd like to share 5 key takeaways that may help you begin your own wellness journey. 1, release trauma from your body. As lawyers, we're trained to leave our emotions out of our work, but our bodies hold on to trauma. If we don't release it, it will manifest in unhealthy ways. Laura Vandernoot-Lipsky talks about this in her book, The Age of Overwhelm. She says, when we don't fully metabolize that which may accumulate within us, it tends to linger and fester and then manifest, sometimes horribly. So we must focus on what we do have power over, even if it's only our mind. I've noticed that if I go too long without addressing the trauma I absorb, I can become snappy with my wife, overly pessimistic, or irritable in ways that I can't explain. Sometimes she'll notice it before I do and ask me, what's wrong? It often takes me hours, sometimes days, to identify the source of my emotions. When I finally identify what's going on, I work to release the trauma from my mind, body, and spirit. What this looks like for me is doing things to process the feelings, emotions, and memories in my mind of the trauma stories I hear. This can be journaling, therapy, or even just giving myself space to feel feelings. To release trauma from my body, I like to exercise, take bubble baths. I'm going to come back to that. I appreciate the comment earlier on bubble baths. And get massages. These sound like indulgences, but I get debilitating headaches when I don't do these things. And to release the trauma from my spirit, I meditate, have a gratitude practice, and spend time in nature. For some people, this may involve a religious practice or prayer. It's anything that brings peace to your soul. On bubble baths, there's a really amazing book that I read recently on this. Like, I'm always trying to learn more on all these subjects. Called Real Self-Care by Pooja Lakshmi. If you haven't read it, highly recommend it. She talks specifically about this whole idea of capitalism is selling us things and calling it self-care as something we can buy, and rather it's really introspective work. And she talks specifically about yoga, and I think the same thing can apply to any of the other things, bubble baths or anything else, where if you're doing it, you're going to a yoga class and you're just kind of going through the motions, and you think that is going to solve your burnout and your stress and all the things, that's not going to work. If for you, yoga is a mindfulness practice where that is your time for yourself that you are carving out and dedicating to what you need in that moment, and that's what you need, then it can be self-care, but there is a distinction. So for me, when I describe those things, they really are things that I'm doing to release the stress in my body, not a Band-Aid solution. And they don't always work. Now, I want to take a moment to talk to the men in the room. I know some of you are thinking to yourselves, this is some woo-woo BS. Or, I'm fine. I don't need to release the trauma. I know this because that's the response I usually get from men when I talk about vicarious trauma. One man doing death row appeals recently told me he doesn't need to do self-care because he loves his work and gets a lot of satisfaction out of it. Doing work that gives you meaning and purpose is amazing. It can really help sustain your ability to stay in this work. That being said, your body is still ingesting the trauma every single day. If you don't find healthy ways to release it, I promise you it will come out in unhealthy ways. Society doesn't give men much space to feel human emotions. The reality is that vicarious trauma is gender blind. Your body will experience these symptoms whether you're aware of it or not. So I encourage you to get out of your comfort zone and really take time to reflect on the ways that trauma exposure may be impacting you. Identifying and addressing vicarious trauma requires an awareness of trauma exposure and planning ahead when you know what I call a heavy trauma day. It also requires you to know your own symptoms. I listed off a bunch of symptoms, and those were just some of them. It's going to manifest differently in each of us, so you need to know what vicarious trauma looks like for you. When I have what I call a heavy trauma day, and I realize that some of you may have that may literally be every day, but there are some days where like you're doing administrative work or you're not meeting with clients, you're doing other things. So even if your job is trauma every day, there may be some days where you know you're going to court or you know you're going to sit through a really intense meeting with a client. And those are the days that I'm talking about where you have to be extra mindful and purposeful. When I have those days, I try to calendar time for myself at the end of the day. I also try not to pack my days too full, try being the operative word in that sentence, to ensure that I have breaks throughout the day. Sometimes when we're so focused on our work, we skip meals, forget to drink water, and sit for long hours. You can't perform your job if you don't take care of your basic needs. And I know that sounds really obvious, but I guarantee most of the people in this room do this all the time, including myself. Sometimes I plan out my self-care at the end of a heavy trauma day, and then when the day is over, I feel fine. And I decide, I'm good. I don't need to do anything this time. And you know what happens? A day or two later, I'm acting out of character and I don't know why. Whether you're conscious of it or not, the trauma's still there.
Aiden, before you go, can you help?
I think it's frozen.
Aiden's our techie.
Might be user error. Oh, it might. I did that, I swear. Okay. Okay,
Thank you,
just
Aiden.
needed a pause. Thank you so much. This brings me to my second takeaway. Know what fills and empties your cup. Understanding what recharges you and what depletes you is crucial. We are all unique and need different things. Releasing trauma requires you to engage in activities that bring you joy, help you reconnect with yourself and others, and ground yourself in the present moment. I personally love being in nature, being physically active, and I also love meditation and yoga. You might hate all of these things. That's totally fine. Maybe you love being at home alone and playing video games. Whatever works for you. Just be mindful that you're not numbing yourself and checking out. You need to metabolize the trauma to release it. If you don't know what fills your cup, take some time to figure it out now. You can't wait until you're struggling to do this. When you're struggling, you're not going to be in a headspace to explore yourself and your needs. You need these things readily accessible. Releasing trauma also requires separation from the trauma exposure. If you never take a break, you'll never give your body the opportunity to recover. Existing in a state of fight or flight forces your body to reshuffle basic bodily functions to prioritize whatever is most crucial for your survival. When you're in fight or flight that goes on for months or years, it impacts all of your body systems, your digestive, cardiac, nervous, and reproductive systems. Therefore, it's vital that you take regular breaks from work. This means completely separating yourself from work at the end of the workday and on the weekends. It also means taking regular vacations during which you do not work. I know, also sounds obvious, but I know most of us don't actually do that. Depending on what area of law you're in or what your workplace culture is, this might seem impossible. I was in private practice for 5 years, and I know what that's like. You're expected to be available to your clients 24/7. I remember waking up each day and checking my email before even getting out of bed. It seemed impossible to find a week out of the year to take a vacation. But if our profession wants to change these dire statistics, we need a major culture shift. When I started my nonprofit, I created a trauma-informed organization. A key aspect was respecting employees' private time, a generous vacation package, and monthly mental health days. At the beginning of 2023, we shifted to a 4-day work week. Around that time, I was at a point of deep burnout and nearing my breaking point. I was deeply pessimistic, lost confidence in myself, and was no longer fulfilled by my work. I was ready to quit my job and leave the legal profession. Having a 4-day work week gave me time to prioritize my mental health. I also completed a wellness challenge called 75 Hard, which required me to prioritize eating healthy and daily exercise. It was life-changing. It took me nearly 9 months, but I recovered from my burnout, and now I'm in a much healthier place. Having a 4-day work week in the legal profession may seem unrealistic, but it's not. It's a choice. It's a choice for employers. It's a choice for each of us. You also need to be aware of what empties your cup and what fills it. If you're working a second or third shift, caring for family members after your first workday ends. Sorry, that was a question. Are you working a second shift or caring for family members after your workday ends? Does your extended family lean on you for emotional or financial support? Does your boss reach out at all hours of the day and on weekends? Addressing vicarious trauma requires us to set boundaries in areas of life that are impacting our well-being. Again, real self-care, entire book on that sentence. It can require us to have tough conversations, make career changes, or even take time off to address your mental health. Building habits and setting boundaries is hard. I encourage you to be kind to yourself and have a just try again tomorrow mindset. You'll have good days and weeks and times where you know you can do better. If I'm being honest with you and myself, the last month or so, I've been really busy and have neglected a lot of my own wellness practices. But I'm not discouraged. I know that every day is a new day and I can start again. I also know that I don't have to do it all every day. What I need to do is to build these practices into my weekly routine so that they're always a part of my life. Speaking of filling cups and emptying them, that brings me to my third takeaway. Address unhealthy coping mechanisms. There's a strong link between trauma and substance use. We already know that vicarious trauma mirrors direct trauma, so it's not surprising then that attorneys have such high incidences of substance use and addiction. Have you ever noticed how all legal events involve alcohol? I didn't notice it until I stopped drinking for the 75 Hard Challenge. I realized how much peer pressure there is at these events to drink. It was so bad that I started ordering a drink that looks like a cocktail just so people would leave me alone. Pro tip, my go-to cocktail is a club soda with a splash of cranberry and a lime. It looks just like a cranberry vodka. I also noticed the extent to which I relied on alcohol to cope with stress. At the end of a long day, I couldn't have a glass of wine to take the edge off. That meant I had to find another coping mechanism. And I didn't realize how hard I had been leaning on alcohol until it wasn't available anymore. Over time, I replaced alcohol with exercise, spending quality time with my wife and our pets, and meditation on my acupressure mat. I want you to be honest with yourself and think about how often you turn to an unhealthy coping mechanism as a crutch to lean on. It could be alcohol, or it could be something else. Overworking, food, gambling, binge watching TV, or even over-exercising. None of these things is inherently bad in moderation. It becomes an issue when they're done in excess or when used to escape from processing trauma. I challenge you to consider what healthy habits you can cultivate in place of these. If you couldn't have that glass of wine at the end of the workday, what would you do instead? Although our profession is well aware of these issues, we never talk about it in the context of vicarious trauma. We must address the underlying trauma that is leading attorneys to turn to these things. My fourth takeaway is self-care is a team sport. Also, Chelsea, I hate that term and I have yet to find a better one, so I apologize, but I feel those feelings. Your support system is essential. Talk to those close to you about vicarious trauma and ask them to help you recognize your symptoms. Ask them what they notice in you when you're not at your best. I guarantee they'll call your attention to things that you're not aware of, just like my wife does. And this will help you know your symptoms. Ask your support system to compassionately call you out when they notice these symptoms and lovingly ask you what you need. Sometimes my wife gets frustrated with me because I'm being difficult or unkind. Over time, she's learned not to get upset with me, and instead she gives me a hug. When these symptoms arise, have your support system hold you accountable for your own self-care. Remember how I said sometimes I block off time for self-care after a heavy trauma day, and then I think I'm fine and don't need it? Now I tell my wife, I blocked off this time because I know I'm going to need it at the end of the day, and she reminds me that even if I don't think I need it, I do. And it really helps keep me on track. Having people who will check in with you and encourage you to follow through on self-care makes all the difference. You can also do this with your coworkers by cultivating a workplace culture that regularly discusses emotional wellness, offers community support, and self-care accountability. Finally, takeaway number 5, remember your why. Whenever I feel overwhelmed, I come back to my why. My why is my clients, survivors of human trafficking who inspire me to continue fighting for justice. I keep a happy binder with positive notes, client successes, and reminders of the lives that I've helped transform. When I feel burnt out, I look through it and remember the client who got a restraining order against her trafficker, the one who can now go to nursing school because her criminal record was cleared, and the mother who won full custody of her children while her abusive ex-husband was denied any custody rights. These moments remind me why I do this work, even on the hardest days. For those of you in law school, keep a copy of your admissions essay as a reminder of your passion and purpose. To say this work is hard but over the course of your career, the impact you have is immeasurable. The lives you touch will be forever changed. You have the power to break generational cycles of trauma and abuse. You can deliver justice to or underrepresented people. We all came to this profession to make a difference. Never lose sight of that. My hope for each of you is that you find ways to take care of yourself so that you can stay in this work as long as you choose to do so. Thank you for being here today, and thank you for all you do.
Okay, we're going to have a fireside chat without the fire. Okay, thank you. Jamie, I've been told to put this on. We'll see if it makes a difference. Am I loud enough? It's really loud, but I don't know. Working? Yeah? Okay. Thank you so much, Jamie. That was truly enlightening, and I have to say, as a slightly older person who went to law school a little while ago, I didn't learn anything about vicarious trauma or trauma-informed lawyering. And I have to say, as I was sitting here thinking, wow, I don't think this applies to me, I remembered the time that I was in court and the judge was crying, and I started crying when we went outside and my client come. I think that might have been it. I'm embarrassed, so I'll make it myself vulnerable too. I also remember falling asleep in my plate at one of those Friday night dinners with colleagues after work. So I want to ask you, why wasn't this there? Who came up with this? When did this start? And when did it become a science? Did it come from the legal profession or the medical profession or somebody who has better, healthy habits than lawyers?
The concept of vicarious trauma, as far as I understand, emerged in the early 90s. The first time it was named was 2 psychologists who were researching the effect of secondary traumatic exposure on therapists working with survivors of trauma. It was initially recognized in fields like social work, psychology, and the medical profession way before the law started to talk about it. The legal field didn't really start talking about vicarious trauma until the late 90s or early 2000s. And even now, it's still a new and novel topic in our profession. I will say that just literally in the last 6 months, I've been getting a lot of requests to talk about vicarious trauma. So I do feel a shift, which is encouraging.
So Are there aspects of being a law student or lawyer that inadvertently inflict trauma on us? When we were having our pre-conversation, we were talking about the fact that our job as lawyers is to think of the worst possible thing that could happen and prevent it. Sorry, I can't see you guys. Which is stressful. But that is that is an occupational hazard. So I'm wondering if there are systemic parts of law school or the legal profession that create trauma, direct trauma, and what we might do about that.
It's funny because when I walked in here, I overheard some, I think, alumni talking about how this room brought back trauma to them from exams. So absolutely. So the answer so in addition to the fact that our bodies ingest this trauma that we hear about, our bodies also don't know the difference between trauma, like your life is in danger trauma or something really bad could happen to you or might happen to you, and normal stress. The exact same response happens in our bodies where it triggers our fight, flight, freeze response. It pumps cortisol into our system and diverts all functioning to staying alive. And yet law school and the legal profession are inherently stressful. And if you think about like law school, you have 3 straight years of being stressed out. So you're 3 years in fight or flight. And then you go into the legal profession and it doesn't get better. So we're living in that state. Plus this idea of, as lawyers, we're always looking, and my wife is not a lawyer and it drives her insane, that like we're always looking for the worst case scenario and always trying to like prevent, we're so risk averse and always trying to prevent that from happening. But doing that just causes us to be, for me at least personally, causes a lot of anxiety. I'm anxious because I'm scared of all the things that could happen, because my brain is just always looking for those things.
So are there things that we could do, like to less, like how could we make the profession lessen or avoid that trauma? Like what would a trauma informed deposition?
Okay, I'm going to address those in 2 parts. One is the
What
profession and the trauma,
profession, yeah.
And then specifically deposition. I really appreciated what Michael Greger was talking about in terms of what they're saying in the educational system, and I think we could apply if we just took those reports and like kind of redid them for lawyers, I think it would be so impactful. We really, and I want to dive into those further, but like we need trauma education needs to be embedded in legal education, and trauma and being trauma informed or trauma aware needs to be embedded in every part of the work that we do. It's already there. We need to identify it, talk about it, address it. And we're not even close to that. And we also, in order for that to happen, just like Michael talked about, we need a culture shift. Our law, like and there's definitely a generational piece here. When I talk to lawyers from generations who have been practicing a lot longer than me, there's just this there's this attitude of just like kind of either like, what are you talking about, or this isn't. There's just this like kind of dismissiveness that I get to talking about trauma and trauma-informed practices. And meanwhile, it's so interesting. I was recently at a national plaintiffs conference, and I kept asking everybody. I was talking specifically to lawyers who work predominantly with sexual assault victims. Like that's the space I was in at the conference. So they're all dealing with trauma every single day. And I kept asking everybody just as like a talking point, like, do you have training on trauma? Does your firm do training on trauma? I had at an entire conference, I had one person say, my firm does annual training on trauma, and she happens to be a survivor who insists that her firm does it. Everybody else said no, and it was mostly young female associates who were like, oh, I really wish we'd had that and really, really need this. I don't really feel equipped to do this work. And then the old male partners just like completely dismissed and like didn't even acknowledge, address, have any interest in talking about that subject. So we need that culture shift. In terms of trauma-informed depositions, I mean, just like in every aspect of the law, and I'm sure this will come up more in the next panel as well, we need to have conversations around what it would look like and how we as attorneys can work hard to not re-traumatize or further traumatize individuals who are being put through our legal system, including the civil legal system. A lot of people do not go through the civil legal system because they're just going to be re-traumatized and may not get the justice they're hoping for, or it may not result in justice. I've been doing expert witness work in cases involving trafficking survivors, and just last week, a child victims of sex trafficking was going to be deposed in a case that I'm an expert on, and I talk about this in my trauma course, and I'm like, let me just see if this actually works in real life, because it's all like, it's very different when you're just saying, oh, this was what a trauma-informed deposition would look like. And I said to the attorney, I said, do you think you could set some ground rules with opposing counsel before they depose the individual and talk to them about language, to what language should be used and what language shouldn't be used, and terminology and things like that, because that's really going to help reduce the harm to this individual of going through this process. And she said, okay. And I honestly, I didn't think opposing counsel would agree to it because it wouldn't help their case. And she did. She agreed to these ground rules at the outset. And even just something like that of, how can we work together? Like, we can still fiercely advocate for our clients without causing further harm. And I think if we took that approach to this work and actually, let that attorney was really trauma informed in their willingness to engage in that, but I think that most of the time that wouldn't happen. But if those lawyers had learned about trauma in law school, they might be more willing to do that in their cases.
What might a trauma-informed law school look like in our future?
Those are two very different questions. I hope it's in our future. I mean, the fact that we're having this symposium is a really good sign, right? That there's a desire to have this conversation, and I think we're going in that direction. I think a lot of people might think it means coddling law students, and that's not at all what it is. It would require educating students and faculty about trauma, acknowledging when there's trauma in course material, giving students the skills to understand trauma and its impact on legal cases. And it's not really changing the material as much as it is contextualizing it and giving students the tools to process what they're taking in and understand it better.
Cool.
I'm sure there's a lot of experts in the room that would have a lot to add to that.
Talk to us about your course on trauma-informed legal skills. How did it come about? How did you design it? What should law schools be doing around that?
I get really excited to talk about this subject. So as I assume almost everybody in this room, did anybody take a semester-long course on trauma in law school? Okay, that's it. Oh, one person? Yeah, was that and I'm not talking you had a lecture, a lot of at this point, if you get one lecture in one class in law school, that's actually more than most people get, and that's really scary given how much trauma is embedded into our everyday work. But I'm talking about a full-on class just on trauma and trauma-informed lawyering. I certainly didn't learn about that. What I learned was, while working with human trafficking survivors, that I could cause a whole lot of harm to my clients and myself if I didn't understand trauma. And then I went on this journey of trying to figure it out, learn it myself. And most of what I learned was at human trafficking conferences or trauma conferences where I was one of the few lawyers in the room. And so I'm learning this all from psychologists and other, social workers and clinicians, but none of it had the lens of, and what does that mean in the law? How do we apply this to our work and our cases? And then some professors would have me come lecture, to their clinic, to their class every year. And so I went to those professors and I said, I really want to teach a class on this subject. What do you think? And, one of them was a professor at USC Law School, and she said, I would make it mandatory for all my clinical students if you taught it. And I'm going to go to the school and ask them that they add this course. And there had actually been a lot of, there had already been conversations about this subject matter and the fact that it was kind of a missing piece. So the school was really open to it. And a really important aspect is that I designed the course with a clinical psychologist. So I have a dear friend who's a clinical psychologist who specializes in trauma and works with trauma survivors in their clinical practice. And so we designed the course together. And we just finished our third year at USC. And I did the same thing at Pepperdine, a professor who asked me to come to her class every year. I said, hey, we're teaching this at USC. Do you think Pepperdine would want this class? And they said, absolutely. So we're going to teach it at Pepperdine too. So that's how the class came about. And sorry, what were the other parts of the question?
Where should we be, how should we be getting this into the curriculum?
One is, I think that like just the same way that professional responsibility is a mandatory class, trauma-informed legal skills or some class on trauma and the law should be mandatory for all law students. I think we're far off on that, but all of my students say this should be, like in our reviews after the semester, the students say this should be a mandatory law school class. So I think that's a good sign. I also think it should be embedded in every part of the curriculum. I mean, when you're talking about, torts or criminal law or constitutional law, like we should be having conversations. How does trauma impact behavior? What happened in that case? Why didn't that person remember things? Like there's so much about how the law functions, and I think we'll get to this of like what it doesn't understand about trauma, but if we embedded that into the law school curriculum and also embedded the trauma-informed practices for ourselves, I think students would come out healthier, for one. They would have a better understanding, they'd be way more equipped to practice law than we're currently preparing them.
Jamie. So I feel like we've been talking about trauma in the context of victims a lot today, and I'm wondering, we don't talk very much about victim offenders, people who are incarcerated, who were traumatized, and that's a part of their history. How do these practices fit into that population?
Thank you for asking that. I've spent the last 7 years with victim offenders of trafficking survivors who are in our criminal legal system and helping them clear their records related to their trafficking is one key aspect of my law practice. And the reality is the vast majority, and I don't think it's going to surprise people in this room, I think it's the people who are not in this room that need to hear this information, but the vast majority of people in our criminal legal system are victims of crime as well. And I'm going to give you some data points on that. 86% of women in U.S. jails and prisons experience sexual violence, 77% experience partner violence, 60% experience caregiver violence. 1 in 6 male inmates report being physically or sexually abused before 18, and many more witnessed interpersonal violence. Over half of male inmates report experiencing childhood physical trauma. So the vast majority of people that we are locking up in this country have trauma. We are not addressing it. We are thinking that somehow this is, protecting society by locking people up when we're never addressing the underlying trauma that they have and why they're like, we don't look at why did this happen? What are the facts around it? What trauma did they have before this happened? Like all the things that would help. Instead, that we're basically just further harming people, as was talked about before. They're suffering a lot more harm in this system, and then we're affecting generations, their children and their families and their communities are all harmed as a result of criminalizing trauma.
Jamie, can you talk a little bit about policy work you've done to try to improve some of these practices?
Yes, so I sit on a statewide policy advocacy coalition of organizations, a lot of individuals with lived experience to advocate for laws specifically around this area of criminalized victim offenders. And in California in 2021, we passed a law called the Justice for Survivors Act, and it embeds in California a trauma-informed approach to victim offenders at every stage of the criminal process. We expanded California's affirmative defense. It was originally just for victims of trafficking. We expanded it to include victims of interpersonal and sexual violence. There's requirements in both plea bargaining and sentencing and resentencing around taking into account an individual's trauma. And even like we were able to get in this like broad language around like if you have childhood trauma, this applies, which is like everybody. So we kind of were able to get this major shift in kind of every aspect of the criminal case where it has to at least be taken into account. It doesn't mean that they won't suffer any consequences for their actions, but it means that like there's a presumption of the low term in sentencing, and at plea bargaining, prosecutors have to take into account their trauma as a mitigating factor. Like it's now written into the law in California. And, I would really like to be in a place where we're not arresting and criminalizing people, but if they are going to be in the system, then we at least need a trauma-informed approach to how we look at what was going on in this set of circumstances. And then we also expanded our vacatur law. this is all one bill. We got all this done. We also expanded our vacatur law to include victims of interpersonal and sexual violence. So now in California, individuals with interpersonal sexual violence and human trafficking can clear nonviolent criminal charges related to their trafficking. I will say that we have tried for the last 3 years to expand it to all crimes and for the affirmative defense and vacatur, and have not succeeded. We're going to go back again this year and try again, but there's a huge resistance to violent offenders of applying these same principles. When it's nonviolent crimes, it's relatively, I wouldn't say there's not opposition, but there's a lot less opposition than when we talk about violent offenders.
Thanks, Jamie. So this is going to be my last question, and then it's going to be your turn. We have 15 minutes left. Start thinking of your questions. Okay. So we talked this morning, I think both Sarah and Will talked about the fact that the legal system itself is not trauma-informed and often doesn't seem to understand trauma at a basic level. And I think of it in the context of like parole hearings and people who may have gone to trial and lost, didn't think they were responsible, and the parole board expects them to accept responsibility or they'll never get out. Or people who go before the parole board have done a heinous crime and they're asked, why did you do it, right? And the person locked out or traumatic response, or they have no idea. Mm-hmm. So talk a little bit about the fact that the impact of the lack of a trauma-informed approach in our legal system and how that impacts people's lives. Sorry, that's a big question.
It is a big question. There's so much to unpack there. I think we spent a whole day on that question. I mean, it goes to everything. If the legal system doesn't understand trauma and behavior, it doesn't understand that if somebody's prefrontal cortex is shut down, they are not thinking rationally and clearly, both with victims and people who are labeled as perpetrators. For victims, there's so much victim blaming that happens in our system of why did they do this? Why didn't they do that? Why did they leave? Why didn't they run? And if you understand like basics of trauma, you understand why the answers to those questions without blaming the victim for things that happened to them. And when we understand trauma and behavior, we'd understand like, why did that person, like if somebody said I blacked out, they don't remember, we'd understand why that's the case. When we put people on the stand and ask them questions, we don't understand memory. We don't understand, how trauma affects somebody in a traumatic moment. So when law enforcement talks to somebody at the scene of a crime, how that's going to be different than a day or two or a week later versus 3 years later. And when they have different memories, that's used to discredit them, regardless of who we're talking about, victims, witnesses, perpetrators. We don't understand trauma and memory and trauma and behavior. And so that's used to discredit them. And like, how many legal movies have we seen where somebody's on the stand and they say something inconsistent with something they said before, and they use that to impeach them? You're either lying then or you're lying now. Which one is it, right? Like, that's always in the movies, and that we see that in real life all the time. The reality is that's trauma. Like, that's totally normal and understandable. And if we just understood like trauma and behavior and trauma and memory, that would completely change how we treat people in the legal system, how we understand what's really going on in these cases. But I don't think the legal system doesn't ask why something happened. It asks, in the criminal system, did a crime happen? Who did it? It doesn't ask why. It doesn't happen. What happened right before that? I have so many clients who, like, the police report just says what happened in that moment. And then when you ask the client what happened that day, that week, put it in the context of their lives. Like, I have a client, just like one example of like so many, and I'm sure you all have your own examples, like this victim of human trafficking who was actively being trafficked was arrested for breaking and entering and stealing a cell phone and something else I can't remember. And when I met with her like soon after this happened, and when you asked what was going on, she had been in a domestic violence incident with her perpetrator the day before. Law enforcement was not able to arrest him. She was breaking into the place where he was with somebody else that he was also trafficking to get her child's car seat so she could escape from her trafficker. And she ends up in jail for trying to break, because she broke and entered into her trafficker's place where he lived. Like, but the legal system doesn't look at that whole story. It just is like, oh, you broke into this person's house and you stole a cell phone. And she stole the cell phone because it was the only proof that she would have of what was really going on. Yeah.
Okay, your turn. I think, Amy, do we have 10 minutes? Yeah, okay. And Delaney? Okay. Your turn. Any questions? Yay, Marcel, thank you.
Hi there. I thought it was really interesting to think about a trauma-informed class, kind of like we think about the professional responsibility class. And it made me feel like, isn't being trauma-informed part of our professional responsibility as attorneys? And I think about what does it mean to be a competent attorney, right? Because not only do you have to be competent in your field of law, but it sounds like, and I think we've learned from today, you have to be culturally competent, you have to be trauma competent, right? So I'm just curious on your thoughts about that. Like, is that something that maybe we need to start talking about in conjunction with professional responsibility, or does it separate it out? I'm thinking out loud. I would love to hear your thoughts.
I'm
None
so
of the
glad you asked
PR
that.
professors.
No, I love that question. And
Oh, Sarah's here. Oh, sorry. Sarah's here. What do you think? I have a unit on trauma-informed lawyer.
that's amazing. Yes, I wish I had that in law school. It's such a great question. It's funny because I left the conference I was talking about, the Plains Law conference, thinking like, how do I get these? Sorry, I'm gonna say it again, like all these old white men who don't want to talk about trauma to talk about trauma. And my answer was professional responsibility. If you if you go through the rules of professional responsibility, and I did, and now have slides in all my trauma trainings about this for lawyers to actually care, and also you can get those credits. It helps to get the ethics credits, it gets them in the room. But if you look at the rules of professional responsibility between our obligations to our clients and our obligations as attorneys and that relate to our own well-being, it is absolutely essential that we understand trauma and how it affects our clients and our work and ourselves. And I think it absolutely should be embedded in professional responsibility as like a really important aspect. And also it needs to be embedded in all these other parts of the law so that we can, fulfill our ethical duties.
Okay. Other questions? You don't even have to stand up. Don't make me call on those 4 men in the back row. You know all their names. You can call on them.
You've got to say something.
Any other questions? Yeah, please.
I'll project from here.
Yeah.
Your example that you gave with the definition of boundaries, on the other side. How do you handle situations in which they are not discussed on the other side? I'm speaking from a prosecutor point of view, where I do refer to victims and survivors, and just as that. A lot of times, defense attorneys do not want that language used. Motions are usually filed to prevent it in trials, which I understand because they have to prove that they were a victim. But how do you try to get reception from people believing that my client is completely innocent, who you're representing isn't even a victim, they're not even a survivor?
It's such a difficult question. I think each case is going to be different. I think if you don't, curious what other people think. If you don't have a receptive person, there may be ways to bring it before the court, like certain things in motion practice. But I really think it's just we have to go further upstream because that's always going to be an issue. We have to go to a point where before they're in that role, in that position, and have that attitude. Because once they're there, they're so ingrained in their mindset that I think it's going to be very difficult to change their perspective. I really do see law school as the way that we transform the culture of our profession. I don't have any answers for you in practice. Maybe somebody that does. Yeah.
I think I have a thought because I come from a criminal defense background, right? I remember filing a lot as to not use the term victim, but at the same time, I think it's mindful to, as you mentioned, what case you're filing that motion in, because if it is a domestic violence case, whether or not the defendant, accepts responsibility, or if there's a question of who did it, right? I think as a trauma-informed lawyer, you don't want to file a motion saying that this person is not a victim. This person may not be this defendant's victim, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they're not a victim. And so I think it's good to keep that in mind, as opposed to somebody who, stole a candy bar from the corner store, right? And the shop owner is calling themselves a victim. That's a little bit different, right? But when it's a really, really simple situation, I can just speak to my own experience. I intentionally don't file those motions just to not only because I'm not only to be trauma informed, but I think it also as an attorney helps you build some credibility and rapport and helps to bring a resolution and a sense of justice for everyone when you can show that, okay, I can be helpful in this situation too. This is an adversary process, but we don't have to beat each other up, right? This is a situation where everybody's hurting on all sides, and how can we find a solution that can address everybody's hurt? Because as we mentioned before, right, a lot of people who are offenders of trauma are victims of trauma themselves, and we have to, also, as you mentioned, not only just think about this from an incarceration perspective, let's just lock them up, but let's get to the issue. And one way to do that is not be so defense-minded that you just, not to say the word victim in every single case. There are cases where the person is actually the victim, and the question is, who did it, right? Your client may not have done it, but you do need to acknowledge and recognize that person. I don't know if that's helpful.
Well, that one really good question to end on. Yay, well, thank you.
I'm wondering if you can share some of the lessons you've learned from your students at USC. So designing the program to begin with in your first year versus now. What are some things that you've learned from them that have adjusted how you teach the course?
That's such a good question. Thank you. I will also say the breathing exercise, I do that with my clients too, and it helps me and it helps my clients. I'm so glad you said that. I was doing it right before I went up. I was like, remember what Mel said, breathe. The biggest thing is how much lived experience there is in the room. We definitely triggered our first year of students because there's we talk a lot about trauma. We try really hard not to give very, graphic stories or anything like that, but about trauma, and we talk about that at the beginning of class. This is going to be hard material, and part of it is grappling with it, working with it. We're very trauma informed in how we do the class, and what space we creating a space, giving people the ability to take breaks and process and do those things. But in our first year, we definitely got some feedback from clients that were triggered by the class, and we really adjusted it in the second and third year to be really mindful and really embedded the understanding that, because we very much talked about our clients as the people with trauma, not us as people with trauma, even though most of us are called to this work because of our own trauma. And so we are, and what we say to our students is you're called to this work because of your own lived experience, and we want to give you the tools to be able to do this work in as healthy way as possible. And so this is going to be hard, and there will be parts of it that trigger your own trauma. And part of learning how to stay in this practice will be, how do you work through that? And we try to give them a lot of tools, and but a lot of things that we've applied over, we now don't just talk about it as the other people with trauma. That's probably the biggest thing. And we've made some other adjustments, but I think that was the biggest one.
Okay, we're done.